Hello everyone, welcome back to Life Science Live. I hope you're all having a wonderful week so far and that you're staying safe with all the snow we've been having on and off. It's been some crazy weather this week. And today we're actually talking a little more about weather one more time. We're going to talk about the way that plants in Utah survive the winter. So we have 4 different groups of plants that we're going to talk about, just like one plant from each of 4 different groups. We're going to start off with coniferous trees. So I'm sure you all know that coniferous trees are mostly evergreen trees. They tend to stay green all year round, and they reproduce with cones rather than making flowers like our deciduous trees, and they don't lose their leaves like deciduous trees most of the time. And the one we're going to talk about specifically is the bristlecone pine. And I'm going to get a picture of what that whole tree looks like here for you. So here's an example of one of the oldest bristlecone pine trees in the world. Its name is Methuselah, and this one is over 5,000 years old. Here's a picture of a little closer up of the branch. You can see some of those pine needles growing on there. And this right here is a even closer look at those little needles. I'll try to get the light not to reflect on them. There we go. So a bristlecone pine tree has bunches of needles in little groups of 5. They're really short needles. And like I mentioned, they have some of the oldest individual trees in the world. And I'm just checking my notes to make sure I don't give you the wrong numbers. Yeah, so Methuselah is over 5,000 years old, and they live, the crazy thing about them is that they live in these really harsh desert environments where most other trees can't survive at all. And even though they're out there in the desert where you think of it being really hot all the time, Utah deserts also get really cold. We talked about that a little bit last week. So the bristlecone pine tree has to put up with really, really hot, dry summers and then really cold winters. And it's crazy that they're able to do that and still survive to be some of the oldest individual trees in the world. Well, the oldest individual trees in the world. The way that they do that is pretty interesting. So first off, the thing that makes it hardest for them to survive, that really short growing season between the hot time and the cold time, makes it so that the bristlecone pine tree grows really slowly. I have a little cross-section of a bristlecone pine tree here. This isn't one of the 1,000-year-old ones, but it's definitely several hundred years old. And if we can get, there we go, you can kind of see those tree rings. And so when the tree is younger, it'll grow a bit faster, but even then those rings are so close together, which is one way you can tell it's not growing very much every year. And then as the tree gets older, it grows even slower and slower, and you can barely even distinguish those rings from each other. It's sort of solid color. Let's see if we can, actually I don't think Facebook lets us flip the screen around, but that's all right. You can still sort of see how close those rings are. And so that really, really slow growth makes the wood of the tree really hard and dense. And so that helps protect it from things like fungus and bugs that might get inside there and weaken the tree. So it's quite a bit stronger and hardier when it has that really dense wood. The slow growth also makes it so it's not putting so much energy into getting bigger. Instead of spending a lot of its energy on growing wider and taller, it can focus that energy on making food that can help it last through the winter. So another thing that they do to save that energy is to have needles that stay on your branches for a really long time. So a bristlecone pine tree's needles can actually stay making energy, getting sunlight and taking in carbon dioxide and putting out oxygen. They can keep doing that for 40 years, which is a long time. Most trees, if you think about a deciduous tree, it loses all of its leaves every year and then grows new ones once a year. But a bristlecone pine keeps those needles for 40 years, and so it never has to put energy, well it does, but it doesn't have to put it in very often into making new needles. These needles are also really good at saving water, and that's general for like most pine trees and some other conifers, is that they have leaves, because needles are the tree's leaves, that are really small and skinny. So if you have a big, flat, deciduous leaf, the water is going to evaporate from it, and it's going to lose a lot of that water. It's not quite as efficient as the tiny little needles of the pine trees that don't have as much room for water to get out. Being really small helps a lot. So when the bristlecone pine tree goes through a drought in the summer, the needles also start kind of changing the way that they save water. And they make some different chemicals, and they have special adjustments in those needles that help them to last. And so by the time winter comes around, they've already made these adjustments and they're not losing so much water, and so they're able to spend more of their focus on just keeping that water in during the winter. And then they also have, it's hard to tell inside this little case, but pine needles have a sort of waxy coating on the outside. So that helps keep the water inside the needles from freezing, and it helps keep it from evaporating. Trees want to conserve as much water as they can, especially when they're slowing down their processes a little bit in the winter. Another thing that helps keep them from freezing is the way that plant cells are set up. So in the winter, the plants are able to push the water out of their cells and into the spaces in between their cells. And so when ice forms in that water because it's gotten cold, instead of rupturing the cells from the inside, it allows the ice to kind of expand in that space between the cells, and the cells don't die. And so they're able to survive that really cold weather. All right, so that's all we have for the coniferous bristlecone pine. The next tree we're going to talk about is actually our state tree, which is the aspen. And we've mentioned deciduous a bunch of times. Aspens are an example of a deciduous tree. Giving away my little next pictures there. So every fall, the aspens turn this really pretty yellow color, and they lose their leaves. So this strategy is pretty useful if you want to make sure that your branches aren't getting weighed down by snow. If you have a lot of leaves on your branches, there's a lot of room for snow to collect, and then your branches get really heavy and they break off. And that's definitely a waste of energy. Trees have to put a lot of work into building those branches and those leaves, and if they just break off every winter in the snow, it's not very efficient. So losing your leaves is a good way to make sure that doesn't happen. And that's kind of different from the way that pine trees do it. These small needles that we were talking about, they don't collect as much snow as a broad leaf might. So those two different strategies are both also ways to help keep branches from breaking off. It also helps the aspen tree, when it loses its leaves, they don't have to lose water from them throughout the winter. But it does make it difficult because then they can't photosynthesize. At least most deciduous trees can't. But the interesting thing about aspens is that they've developed a way to keep photosynthesizing even without their leaves. And the way that they do that is with their stems. So if you look, this is a picture of some aspen bark. They have this really cool white bark. And this is a knife somebody cut off a little piece of that outer layer of bark. And underneath you can see that there is a green layer of living bark. And that layer of bark is green in part because it's full of chloroplasts, which is the part of the cell that can photosynthesize, that makes energy from sunlight and carbon dioxide. And so when the tree has this photosynthesizing layer of bark, it's able to keep making energy throughout the winter, even though it doesn't have leaves. Probably not quite as good at photosynthesizing as the leaves would be, because leaves can be like little solar panels that just kind of reach right out and collect all that sunlight. But it still gives them that extra burst of energy that they need to make it through the winter. Here's kind of a picture of some aspen trees in the winter, and you can sort of tell just barely that they have a greenish tint to them because that outer layer of bark is so thin and so light colored that greenish color can just kind of shine right through. You can see a little bit of it just in the coloration of those stems. Aspen trees are super cool. They can get to be really old too, but not like bristlecone pine. Bristlecone pine will grow a single tree that just lives for a really long time. Aspen trees are a clonal species, which means that they reproduce by putting underground stems out that grow new branches. new like above ground trees. So the old trees will die off, and then the new branches, the new trees that have grown from those underground stems will keep living, and then they'll make more underground stems that sort of connect all the trees together. So one big group of aspen trees called a stand of aspen trees can survive for thousands of years. There's one in Utah that's somewhere around 80,000 years old. And the individual branches aren't that old, the individual trees aren't that old, but overall, that same stand of trees with those same genetics has been there for a really long time. And it actually makes it's one of the reasons that aspen trees will all pretty much, if you're in one spot, you'll notice that all the aspen trees turn yellow at the same time. And that's because a lot of the time, they're exactly genetically identical. So all of them use the same cues and timing to change color and to lose their leaves. All right, so that's all that we have for perennial trees and the aspen tree, or deciduous trees, the aspen tree. Next, we're going to talk about some perennial plants. And so some of the animals that we talked about last week, they choose to go underground in the winter or to find somewhere sheltered from the elements so that they can hide away from the cold and the snow and the wind. Plants sometimes do the same thing. So the above ground part of the plant, it will die off in the winter. But the underground part of the plant, the roots and the bulbs, they'll keep on living. And they actually will get energy from sugars that they've stored up throughout the year. So as the plant is growing above ground during the summer and the spring, when there's lots of resources and it's not so cold, they'll store those sugars in their roots underground. And then once it starts to get cold and the above ground part of the plant dies, the roots underground have those resources that they can keep pulling from. Sometimes those roots will also push water out of their cells and into the soil surrounding them. That way they don't have to worry about water being in the roots and possibly expanding and breaking their cells. They just push it out, and then once things start to thaw, that water melts, and then it's right there for those roots to grab as soon as the spring comes, and they can use that water to start growing above ground again. So they're called perennial because they seem to die every year and then keep coming back. That's one way that we talk about a perennial thing is something that happens every year, and that's definitely what happens with perennial plants, that they die off and then come back, even though they're not completely dying. One really cool perennial plant, one of my favorite plants of all time, is this little guy called the San Rafael cactus. And so this one sort of takes the underground thing to an extreme. You can see right here, the little cacti are just barely poking up above the surface of the soil. And most of the time, San Rafael cacti will spend almost their entire year underground. They'll shrink up and then just stay underground. Sometimes they might be barely above the surface like these ones, so you can hardly see them. And then they only grow taller when they want to flower. So here's a picture of one flowering. You can see it's kind of swollen up above the surface, and it's made its flowers so that it can spread some pollen and collect pollen from other cacti. And then once it's done, it'll shrink back down underground, and then it'll survive drought that way and also survive the cold that way. So by staying underground, it's protected from the harshest elements most of the year. And this cactus is actually, there's not that much known about it because, for one, it only grows in a little part of Utah near the San Rafael Swell. That's where it gets its name from. And then it also is really, really rare even there. It's hard to find because it spends so much time underground, and there's only about 6,000 individuals as far as scientists have been able to estimate. So it's really interesting to think about how it might survive, and I think it's interesting to think about how it gets its energy the rest of the year, because when it's spending so much time underground, it doesn't have any access to sunlight to reproduce. So if you can think of some ways that the San Rafael cactus might get its energy the rest of the year, you can stick them in the chat or you can put them in the comments of the video later on. I'd love to see what your ideas are. All right, our last plant. So we just talked about a perennial plant. Now we're going to talk about an annual plant. And so that means this plant lives for only a year. They kind of just decide not to survive the winter at all. So a great example of this is some of the invasive grasses that we have here in Utah. The most kind of infamous one is cheatgrass. And here's a picture of what that looks like. You've probably seen it growing as a weed in your yard, or in like, sometimes it'll just spread and fill an entire field. You can find cheatgrass all over Utah. And the reason it does so well is because of this annual strategy that it has. So in the spring, cheatgrass will grow really fast. Often it'll grow even before the other plants start to grow. And it will take up all the resources that it can get and make sure that none of the other plants can get to them. And that's where it gets its name from, partially the name cheatgrass, because it's cheating all the other plants out of their resources. It takes up as much water and nutrients as it can. It builds up a nice big seed head. This is what a cheatgrass seed head looks like that we were looking at. So all of these things here are the little baby cheatgrass seeds. And they've got some nasty looking hairs that grow on them. Those are called awns. And they make them slightly less fun for animals to eat. But you can actually feed them. Cows will eat them. And some ranchers even like to have some cheatgrass because it grows so early and it can provide really good early season forage for those cattle. But they make a lot of seeds because that's all they really exist to do. They make lots and lots of seeds and then they die even before summer really hits. So they don't have to put up with the drought, and then as the fall comes around, the seeds are just scattered all over the ground, and as winter comes, they get buried by the snow, and so the living plant doesn't even have to put up with winter either. The seeds just sit there under the snow, they get ready to germinate, and then as soon as it gets warm enough and there's enough water, accessible water that's not all frozen, they shoot up really fast. Those seeds germinate, they grow, and they start taking up all the resources again as fast as they can, just to try to make more seeds for the next year. So it works pretty well. If you don't want to deal with the problem, you just avoid it completely, and that's definitely what cheatgrass does. And it works pretty well for it. It's one reason that it's so hard to get rid of, because it's a great strategy, especially here where there aren't that many resources in the winter or the summer anyway. All right, and that was our last plant. So if you have any questions about how plants survive the winter, or if you think of any other kinds of plants that you'd like to know about, you can leave a comment or come to the museum and talk to us about it here. We hope that you're having a great week, and we will see you next week at Life Science Live. If you'd like to know more about how plants survive the winter, you can also keep an eye on our social media for our next field trip video, which will also be about plants in the winter. We'll see you soon. Bye.